Before Henry VIII, there was another heir to the throne. His brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, married to Katharine of Aragon and dead at 15. What kind of king might Arthur Tudor have been? Today I'm joined by Gareth Streeter, author of Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's lost brother, and the voice behind Royal History Geeks. We'll explore how Henry VII built myth and meaning into the very name Arthur, what kind of king he might have been, whether he'd always been fragile or sickly, the ever thorny consummation question, and what the sources suggest about Arthur's character, education, and untimely death. Let's chat with Gareth. A huge welcome, a warm welcome to Gareth Streeter to my channel today to talk about his work, and in particular his book, Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's Lost Brother. So I think Arthur Tudor is going to be the main subject of today's interview. So thank you, Gareth, for joining us. It's really lovely to have you here.
Oh, brilliant to be here. A real privilege, actually, to be here speaking to you, Claire. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, I first came across you with your Royal History Geeks social
Mm.
media accounts, and you've built a really strong following with that. But what's behind that? What first sparked your interest in history, and why the Tudors in particular?
I think it's a good question. So when I was a teenager, quite out of nowhere, I became a real royalist. Very interested in the monarchy as an institution. And not, I say out of nowhere because well, my family would be broadly monarchist in the way that most English people kind of are, but there'd be no particular sort of push from it at home. But I just became very fascinated with the idea of royalty, and because I also liked history, and I'm lucky I grew up. And in fact, still live in Plymouth in Devon, where there is a lot of history around. And I think I effectively combined the two in terms of being interested in royalty, interested in history. History was always my favorite subject at school. And I guess therefore I just became increasingly interested in the history of the monarchy as an institution, which I guess is kind of the same. It's not the same as the history of Britain and the history of England, because obviously there's social history, there's all sorts of aspects of history, but the two are so entwined. As to where I ended up with the Tudors, I think there's just something about the 15th and 16th century that when you're passing through a study of history, you sort of stop there, land there, and never quite escape because there's so much there, and there's always another stone to overturn and to find something new. And my love of the Tudors in particular has probably only been amplified by the various popular culture expressions of that as well, even if it's out of a frustration to want to go back and check what the truth was. And I don't see that ever ending for me, or I dare say for you either.
No, I don't think so. They grab you, don't they, the Tudors?
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
don't know whether it's their larger than life kind of soap opera style lives or what it is, but
Mm,
they grab you, and I think once they've grabbed you, you can't get away from them.
mm,
But
absolutely.
what drew you specifically to Arthur as the subject for your biography, for a
I
full biography?
I think it's because my pride the Tudor that I most admire is Henry VII, who in many senses you could argue people see him as the first modern king. I think he was probably the last medieval king. I mean, you could probably have a debate as to what that means, and all those categories are always very limited. And I think that a biography of Henry VII for a first-time writer would be incredibly ambitious. But Arthur is a very good perspective to look at the end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. And I always wondered whether looking at it from his vantage point, a reasonably unexplored vantage point, would cast new light onto it all. And I think it probably did for me as the researcher and as the writer. I'm also fascinated by people who are footnotes. So when somebody only seems to serve a purpose in the story of another, and Arthur, I think, has served a purpose in the telling of Henry VII's story, uh, of Henry VIII's story, i.e., the reason we have Henry VIII, and of course, Catherine of Aragon's story, and never in a particularly positive way, especially for poor Catherine of Aragon. So I'm always intrigued to think, okay, what's the story beneath the story here? And I bet you no human being is ever a footnote. They live their own life and they're the main character of their own story. So to discover that for someone who rarely got the spotlight was a very intriguing proposition for me.
Yeah, because he's badly neglected, and yeah, as you say, he's just part of other people's story. And
Hmm.
he's seen as Henry VIII's older brother who never came to the throne. So what surprised you most when you dug deeper into Arthur's story?
There were probably two things, and none of them were groundbreaking. I certainly couldn't claim to have come across, a hitherto undiscovered fact about Arthur, and source material is limited. You will be aware of having studied similarly so-called peripheral figures. One of the reasons they've remained peripheral often is because of a lack of obvious source material. Arthur's an unusual one in that you have entire days of his life which are chronicled in minute detail, and then years and years in between where you don't even know where he's living, although you could probably make a guess. So, but two things did surprise me, or allow me to change my perspective. One was that the Victorians, who, as you know better than I do, are the reason we have access to a lot of the source material we do today because they went and gathered it from around the world. The Victorians had a view of Arthur, which was that he was quite a young, sickly prince. They had a similar view of Edward VI. More recent writers who have written about Arthur, again, normally as a prelude to Henry VIII, have taken a different view and seen him as a quite robust, athletic prince. I was surprised in my research to think that actually the Victorians were probably closer to being accurate in terms of their understanding of Arthur's health. To say he was ever sickly is certainly not true, and to be precise as to what his ill health, if that's what it was, had been is very difficult to say. But there is a question mark. The fragility is the word that the contemporary sources use that hangs over him, and that was a surprise to me because I thought that was a slightly outdated view, but I thought it was quite typical. More happily, however, almost everybody agrees that Arthur was a very isolated figure, sent away from his family at a young age, raised to be almost a loner and to trust nobody, all of which I think is true. But there are signs that he was perhaps closer, both emotionally and geographically, to his family at various points and more than I thought. And that for me was just somewhat encouraging. He is generally seen as quite a tragic figure, and it was just in some ways quite comforting to think that perhaps there were elements of both family and friendship that were true and part of his life in a way that perhaps brought some joy to it.
I hope so. He had such a short life. It would be nice to think
Absolutely.
that he did see his family more than we think.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I love that Henry VII built so much myth and symbolism around
Mm,
Arthur's, very name, after the legendary King Arthur. How central was Arthur to the Tudor dynasty's propaganda and identity? And why do you think that Henry VII was so drawn to, the whole Camelot and King Arthur
mm.
legend?
I think there are two reasons. So I think at the beginning, the Arthurian myth was very important. I think there are two reasons for that. One is that Henry VII, as many listeners to this will know, had a very insecure claim to the throne. And in the early years, this is a world where Richard III, who had a much better claim than Henry in most ways that it would be perceived, only lasted 3 years. And before that, of course, Edward IV had a pretty shaky beginning to his reign, and before that, Henry VI had been deposed. So we must remember how insecure anybody would have been at this stage, let alone someone whose blood claim really was just a trickle. And he was looking, I think, for ways to identify a sense of legitimacy around his reign. He claimed and probably believed to be descended from the ancient kings of Britain, the people that had ruled over the island before the Anglo-Saxons had arrived. And they had, of course, prophesied that one day a prince would come out of Brittany to restore the true British line to the throne. Henry VII believed himself to be that king that had come out of Brittany, admittedly by way of France, to do that. So therefore he could say, not only am I a legitimate king, I'm the first legitimate king in 800 years, which is clearly a bit of an allegorical stretch, but it was thematically interesting. And therefore he named his son after the most famous of the ancient British kings, which was Arthur. And he had his son born in Winchester, which is where they believed then Camelot had once stood. But there's also another much more practical and much more PR savvy reason, I think, that Arthur was born in Winchester and called Arthur. And that's because just in the early months, actually, of the year 1485 that would see the Tudors come to the throne, thanks to the joys of the printing press, the Arthurian literature that the upper classes would have been familiar with for some time had been printed and disseminated in English more widely than ever had been previously. And it was very popular. And I think, in one sense, Henry VII, yes, was doing something very grand, but he was also trying to ride a popular wave and associate himself with it.
Clever. I've never heard that one. That's a good
It,
theory.
it
That's
only it only came to me as I was researching the background to the Arthurian literature
mm,
and realized it was that poignantly similar same year, 1485,
yeah.
that all this is happening, and you think, okay, that's clever.
Yes, very sensible.
Mm,
Yeah. And Arthur was obviously sent, after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he was sent to sort of Ludlow to the
mm.
Welsh marches, and he was given quite a surprising amount of independence there. Was this completely usual? And what does it tell us about Henry
It,
VII's style of kingship and his
it
vision?
It was following the precedent, really, that Edward IV had put in place with his eldest son. Many listeners will know that Ludlow Castle and all that territory around the Welsh Marches had come into the possession of the crown through the House of York. The House of York had been heirs to the ancient earldom of March, and had come to the crown that way, and Henry VII had retained it. So Arthur was sent there in the footsteps of his uncle, Edward IV. We think Arthur was sent there when he was around 6. That's certainly when he took up positions there, and it's probably likely that he was resident there from then or then thereabouts. So he knew it very well. He had a very well established court around him. It was a very carefully put together regime around him, probably more carefully put together than Edward IV had managed to do for his son, and the realm was better represented around it, and no one person or no one faction had dominance over Arthur. But it effectively became a secondary government. It was as fully well, not quite, but it was almost as fully functioning as the government in Westminster. So not only was it a training ground for Arthur, not only was it a regional government over that part of England and Wales, it was also a government in reserve. So if anything had happened, if the Tudors had fallen in London, they could pretty much swing into Ludlow straight away. So Arthur was not just a part of the future, he was part of the political setup in the here and
Mm.
now.
Good planning from Henry VII
Hmm.
there. I
Everything
mean,
was thought through with Henry VII.
yes, yeah,
Absolutely everything.
yeah.
And I think Elizabeth of York and Margaret Beaufort were also very central to that, Arthur's
Mm,
mother and grandmother, because if you look at the networks of people around Arthur, you see their influence in that as well. And I think that as a team, those three left very few stones unturned in terms of what we'd call their scenario mapping and their thinking about the future.
yeah. Quite a power team.
Hmm, I think
Now,
so.
your book paints Arthur as educated, cultivated, and engaged. And So based on the evidence, what kind of king do you think Arthur would have been? Would he have been very different to his brother, how his brother turned out?
It's so difficult to say, of course. And I think as historians, we're always worried about the counterfactual, aren't we? Because we ultimately just don't know. But and similarly, I do paint Arthur as very intellectually savvy, and I think there is good reasons to think that, although frustratingly, our biggest source, Bernard Andre, who wrote about Arthur's intellectual prowess, was also Arthur's tutor. So he had a biased interest in talking about how wonderful both Arthur was and how wonderful Andre was by
Mm.
extension. Nevertheless, I think there is some evidence to suggest he was studious and pretty good at what he was doing. I think the main thing that would have been different is the circumstances would have been very different because probably without Arthur dying, you then don't get Elizabeth of York dying quite so young. And I don't think the last decade or near decade of Henry VII's reign would probably have been quite as brutal as it ended up being. Similarly, Arthur was so much better prepared to swing into action straight away. He would have had a much more organized machine. And what historians, now I'm more a historian of the 15th century than I am the 16th, but what I think historians of the early 16th century would say is that the first 10 years of Henry VIII, you have quite a chaotic approach to government until Wolsey effectively wrestles control of it and sort of is able to put himself at the head of a quite complicated network of machinery that Henry VII created. Arthur wouldn't have had that wasted decade. It would have been cemented much more quickly, I think, in terms
Yeah.
of government. As to what comes later and all the colourful things we think about with Henry VIII, the circumstances would have been so different. If Arthur had done similar things to his brother, they would have played out very differently just because I think the backdrop would have been so different.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Henry VIII was so young when he came to the
Mm,
throne and hadn't been groomed. Well, not till after Arthur's death. He'd had that very short time of being
mm.
groomed to be king. So, yeah, it's
And as far as we
interesting.
know, Henry VIII had never been resident in Ludlow. So although he had,
Yes.
I think, still been president of the Council of the Marches, it was really name only. There wasn't that same kind of development.
Mhm. Moving on to Arthur's relationship with Catherine of Aragon,
Mm,
his marriage. I mean, that's it's famous largely because of what happens later with,
mm,
Henry VIII and the Great Matter and all that. I'd like to actually ask you the big question, the consummation question. Um, how do you approach such a contentious topic? And what's your actual
mm.
opinion on that?
It's certainly the question everyone wants to know the answer to, isn't it? And of course, frustratingly, it's the one we can never answer with any real degree of certainty or confidence. Interesting, when I was doing my research about it, I came across your video, Claire, on the topic, and I thought you had a much more level-headed approach to it than we normally see. So I thought that was very valuable. But what I think the big problem is with this discussion is that we tend to, when we quote our sources, we look at the colourful sources that emerge in the late 1520s and the early 1530s, some 2 decades, nearly 3 decades after Arthur's actually dead. What we hear then is evidence given in the trial in Blackfriars, which, as everybody, well, not everybody, many people will know, is where Henry VIII effectively convened a trial in order to obtain his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And then you hear, at around a similar time, a few years later, a similar evidence gathering exercise going on in Spain where people come forward and give their testimonies as to what they think happened. These are two highly charged political events. And the way that that evidence is gathered has to give us incredible pause before we take it too seriously, which doesn't mean it should be dismissed. And that's where we get the tales, both of Arthur supposedly bragging that he had spent the night in Spain and it was thirsty work and bring me some ale, Willoughby, and all that sort of boyish banter. That's where we get that from. And similarly, well, it's also where we get the tale that Arthur was so decrepit he couldn't possibly be with a woman, and all the women were laughing at him, and the idea that he could possibly. Yet it all comes from then in the most highly charged of political environments. And I think we would do wise to not dismiss it altogether, but to come back to that when we've already started to look at some of the evidence nearer the time. And I think the best clues we're ever going to get could be found in the letters in the run up to Arthur and Catherine's marriage between England and Spain, and in the weeks and months after Arthur's death. It's very clear, well, it's not very clear, it is arguably clear from those that before Catherine came, Henry VII had serious concerns about Arthur entering a long-term sexual relationship because of fears around his fragility, as it was called. It is also clear, and this is very, very important, that after Arthur died, nobody considered it that big a deal as to whether Arthur or Catherine had slept together. It was not considered to be an insurmountable barrier to to Catherine and Henry, then subsequently marrying. And of course, Isabella and Ferdinand, Catherine's parents, had seen one of their other daughters marry her sister's widow. So everybody, and they'd had a child together. So there was no question of consummation. Everyone knew this was possible if the political will was there. The English say, well, come, whatever happens, we want to treat that marriage as if it was consummated, just to be belt and braces. The Spanish, despite not really having any reason to lie about it, are very reluctant to do that, and they seem to genuinely believe that the marriage wasn't consummated. Isabella, in particular, seems pretty clear that she doesn't believe it was. When we think about who has best access, despite geography, to Catherine's Spanish servants, I think we should take Isabella's reluctance to believe the marriage was consummated quite seriously.
Yeah, because she would have been communicating with them, wouldn't she?
She would, and I think the key thing is people say, oh well, of course Catherine lied. Well, as far as we know, no one actually asked Catherine directly in 1502. They
Mm,
might have done, but
yeah,
testimony doesn't survive from that time. Also, of course, Catherine would have lied, or of course, Isabella would have lied because they wanted to shore up the marriage with Henry, which they certainly did at this stage. But the English weren't that bothered about it. So it's not so convincing to think that they would have concocted it. And it seems as if Isabella actually went to some lengths to make sure that the marriage to between Henry and Catherine would be valid either way, because she was worried that we were all going around saying the marriage has been consummated, and she genuinely seems to believe that it wasn't. I think
yeah,
that's significant.
yeah. She wanted to kind of cover all dispensation.
She
Mm,
did. She did. And
yeah,
I think when we get to the latter evidence, did Arthur say, that was thirsty work, bring me some ale? Maybe. But would he be the first or last 15-year-old boy in history to exaggerate his sexual prowess? Particularly if he was embarrassed that perhaps he hadn't performed as
yeah,
he might have liked to.
yes. I mean, the marriage was so short-lived.
Mm,
They got married in November 1501. He died in April
mm.
1502, didn't he? Um, what what do we know and what remains a mystery about how he died? What are your thoughts on
It's pr- it's
cause of
it's
death?
it's pretty mysterious. There's reference, a very slightly obscure reference to the singular parts of him being driven inward, which has led some people to a theory of testicular cancer. I think that probably is a stretch based on that one comment, but it's certainly odd. What I think we can say it, is that there are things that could be learned if we look at what was going on around Ludlow at the time and other parts of Herefordshire at the time. Because people have always said, was it the sweating sickness? It seems that if it was sudden, if it came out of nowhere, if he'd been otherwise healthy, it seems to fit the bill of the sweating sickness. And Catherine maybe was ill, although that's not clear, but could have recovered. And that's that, as we know, that happens with the sweating sickness. If it was a sweating sickness, there seems to have been no other recorded outbreak of it in England in 1502. So it would have to have been pretty localized, which is possible, but perhaps not the most likely explanation. What we do know is that I believe certainly in Ludlow, if not in the whole of Herefordshire, 1502 had the highest death rate in that area of the, or the second highest death rate in that area in the 16th century. So there is clearly disease of some description or something in the air. What also, as far as we know, is that no other Ludlow Castle residents, in terms of the senior officers that were present, in terms of Catherine and her ladies, none of them seem to have perished from whatever it was. So for me, that suggests that there was some degree of localized illness that had a well-fed and well-cared for member of the nobility got, they probably would have been able to fight off, but perhaps those more from the peasant class would not have had the health infrastructure to fight off, and perhaps a slightly ill adolescent also might not have been able to fight off. That seems to me to be the sort of ballpark area we're looking at for Arthur's death.
Okay, so you don't go with sweating sickness, then you think
I,
it's something else.
I don't not go with it.
Mm.
I mean, this is the thing that's so horrible with history, isn't it? Also brilliant about history. But I've done this book. I didn't have time to become an expert on the sweating sickness
No.
in the 16th century. So it seems to me odd the why it would just break out there and there'd be no other recorded instance in Ludlow. But it could be that an expert on the sweating sickness is listening to this and says, actually, that's really common for how we think the sweating sickness worked. In which case, okay,
Yeah.
fine. But I think some combination of local disease and underlying health vulnerability best
Okay.
meets what we know.
And we're not going to know unless we exhume him, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much you'd know from, I don't know, whether a
No, and he
pathologist today
and of
could.
and of course he was disemboweled in terms of all his organs were
Oh
taken out. So
yeah,
he's not
yeah.
all in one place if we were to
No,
find him.
that's true. Mm. Yeah. Okay, we won't bother pushing for that then.
We'll stick to getting the princess in the tower exhumed, shall we?
Yes, yeah. Now, Arthur's world, was still shaped by the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses.
Mm.
I mean, they were still very much in living history. So, how did that uncertainty affect his upbringing?
It's impossible, I think, to think that it wouldn't have been reasonably forefront on his mind. Unfortunately, we don't know his take on any of it. What we absolutely can assume is that he was aware of a pretender, or well, someone who he would certainly have believed was a pretender, claiming to be his uncle and the rightful king of England, in terms of Perkin Warbeck claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes in the Tower. And that went on during a crucial period in the 1490s. Arthur was very directly affected by that because it was one of the reasons, most likely, that in the early 1490s, his toddler engagement to Catherine of Aragon was broken off by the Spanish. So although they had been betrothed at a young age, Arthur was, I think, just 18 months. That was actually broken off in the 1490s. A lot of people don't realize that. So this whole thing that Catherine believed from the cradle she'd be going to England, she probably didn't, because for a lot of her childhood, it wasn't on the table. And there was no way that Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish Catholic kings, were going to send their youngest child to become queen of a country when she might not survive if the man she was going to marry wasn't actually likely to hold the throne. So that had a very direct impact on Arthur. And actually, it wasn't until the tide began turning in that campaign, when it became obvious in 1495, 1496, that there just wasn't strong support for the pretender in England, that marriage negotiations reopened. So I suspect that Arthur had a very general sense of the insecurity of previous decades and what that meant for him, and I suspect he had a very specific sense as to what that meant for his marriage.
Okay, thank you. Now, moving on to you now and away from Arthur a little bit. So, you run Royal History Geeks,
Hmm.
and that's really quite a lively and engaged online community. How has that shaped the way that you research and you share history?
It it has certainly shaped it a lot because and actually it made me think quite seriously about whether it was right for me to start publishing because the spirit of Royal History Geeks is that we're all geeks and enthusiasts together, learning together, and there isn't an expert. There's no, we never allow language like, well, I'm sorry, but I've got a PhD, so you have to listen to me. Or it's like, no, that your authority is what you say, what you discover. It's not about who you are or what your credentials are, which doesn't mean those things are unimportant, but that's we're a team of enthusiasts together, just starting with this passion of history. Some people might start by just they've seen something on TV or an old film or they've read something and they want to chat. And so long as they're prepared to come on the journey of exploring what the history is behind it, their starting point can be absolutely anywhere they like. So I did worry that by going down a more conventional publishing route, it would take away from that. But I hope that it hasn't, because I think the way that you write can have an impact on that. And it has made it very important to me that I write in a very accessible way and that I'm clear about what I know, I'm clear about what's speculation when it's speculation, and that I tell people a good, cohesive story. I think it's so important that when you write a book, you package it in such a way that someone can see the sort of clear beginning, middle, and the end. So I think it did
Hmm.
impact my approach to doing the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, your writing is certainly accessible, and I'm, that's what I try to be,
Hmm.
as well in my work. And I think what's great about these communities, when you've got an online community, is that you may be, the person that's written books and is seen as an expert, but I found that I learned just as much from the questions that
Hmm.
people pose to me that really make me think about another point of view, or when they share their opinions, and you all learn from each other, don't you?
Hmm.
So I think it's wonderful
You
to have a
do.
community.
And I have to say, I think the work you did with the Anne Boleyn files has set the standard for online royal history discussion.
Oh, thank
Now,
you.
I think it very much paved the way. When I got involved in this world, I don't think I'd realised how established there already was as an audience because of the work that you and others, of course, particularly
Mm.
around Anne Boleyn, had done. So I think that a lot of us are benefiting from that in your wake, so to speak.
Oh, thank you. So going on to your writing
Hmm.
process, what is your typical writing process? Are you a very strict, routine-driven writer, or more of a binge researcher and writer?
So I write for a living, and I always have. So I'm a PR guy in real life, if you like, and increasingly a writer. So the writing isn't something I have to spend very long on. So what I so the research, which was a newer skill, I've done quite a lot of research before, but it was a slightly newer skill for me, was where I spent a lot of um, what I spent a lot of the time doing, and that's my ongoing bit. And then I pulled every, and the great thing about doing someone like Arthur is you're not actually engaging with that much scholarship on the person himself because there isn't that much, and there's obviously a lot on adjacent figures. So what you're really trying to do is pull together a timeline of literally where he may have been as at any given moment, which if you're doing Henry VIII, that's less of what you're doing. There's an element of it, but you're really trying to sketch out literally where might he have been living, what sort of activities might have been doing. So I really started with looking through all the sources that are available, pulling them into a timeline, organizing them into chapters, just dumping any notes that were relevant into those chapters. Then what I would normally do is I'd go away for a long weekend or a week once, just sort of to a hotel room by myself and actually blitz the writing, because
Mm,
that for me, I knew could always come together quickly, whereas the research was a much more extensive process.
yeah. And during your research, was there a particular source, a letter or a document that kind of gave you a goosebumps moment while writing the book? Was there anything that stood out or that changed your mind about something?
I don't know if there was a goosebump moment, only in that um only in that the source material is just so sparse. So I don't know if it was a goosebump moment, but you know how I was saying earlier how I thought there was evidence that Arthur was closer to the family unit of that first Tudor royal family than was previously believed. What I there was a summer in the 1490s when it's clear that Arthur is at court at Woodstock with the rest of the family. But we only know about it because a visiting Italian ambassador writes about it. That's the only reason we know. However, what I also noticed was just after the summer, Henry VII paid Arthur's musicians a reward, which suggested he'd probably recently seen them in action. Then I thought, well, hang on, that makes sense because we knew Arthur was with him. But then I started noticing around the similar sort of time in other years, he was also making those payments. Now, it could just be that he did that every summer. But actually, I thought, but hang on, if it weren't for that letter, we'd only have this payment. So where we've also got those payments, maybe Arthur was there a bit more than we think. And we know that so much is lost to us from that era, and thank God we do have the diplomatic correspondences that shed some light on it. And that was a bit of a this could be a pattern that Arthur spent summers with the royal
Mm.
family.
Yeah, an annual visit.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I know you've already mentioned about accessibility sort of being important in what you do.
mm,
So how do you balance when you're writing a book, accessibility and engagement and the kind of the scholarship and being sort of
mm.
rigorous with your, being meticulous? How do you combine the two? Does it come
Um,
naturally?
It does come reasonably naturally, just because my whole career has been about taking reasonably complicated ideas and trying to explain them simply. But one of the particular ways I did that with this book, which I don't know was actually 100% successful, was I paused the narrative well, about three times to take an issue and then examine that particular issue. So
Mm.
Arthur's health, the consummation question between Arthur and Catherine, and then something around, what Arthur looked like, etc. And sort of did those thematically. And actually, some people's feedback was generally very kind. They said, actually, we found that weird because we felt we were jumping around the narrative. So if I think if I were doing it again, I might have not done that, but stitched those bits, broken up the conversations and stitched them
Mhm.
around the narrative. Because I think it is, people have made a decision to read a narrative history book and not an academic history book. And I think that although certainly there's nothing more important than sticking to the sources in as much as the sources are available. But I think you do have to accept that when you're communicating in that style, the emphasis has to be on giving a cohesive narrative over and above an academic conversation. I
Yeah.
don't know, do you agree with that, or do you think I'm settling too easily on that?
I think your book worked as it was. I didn't find it jarring or anything. Is that what people were saying, that they found it kind of jarring to not have it continue as a narrative?
So I think the main thing, I think it's about, I think some people are very, when they're reading a biography where you
Mm.
want to start someone's birth and end with their death, which is reasonable, it's a bit weird if, like, so the chapter on Arthur's health, which was sort of two-thirds way through the book, I was going back to him being a baby when he hadn't been a baby in
Yeah,
the narrative for quite a few pages at that point. I can see how that makes you, oh, hang on a minute. So it's interesting. I quite like it. Alison Weir did it in
yeah.
her earlier books, but she doesn't so much now. And I used to really
Mm.
like that. But I guess it depends a bit on personal preference, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it does. It depends on the read. I mean, I had the same. People weren't quite sure. Some people weren't sure about my Anne Boleyn collections because they really are just collections of blog posts. They are what they say
Mm,
on the tin, they're collections. But some people don't like that. They
right.
prefer, a narrative. But yeah, different people have different views. So you
Mm.
can't please everyone, I think, at the end of the day,
No.
the writer. So
Yeah. It's
yeah.
tricky. It is tricky.
But you've also written fiction. You've written short stories on historical figures. And do you find that fiction gives you more freedom than factual writing?
It certainly does give you more freedom. Interestingly, because most of the fiction I write is not, I have written some historical fiction, but most of the fiction I write is not historical fiction.
Okay.
Partly because I know rightly how concerned people are to ensure it sticks to the history, which I sort of agree with. But then I think, well, what's the point in doing fiction if you
Yes.
if you're doing that? So I've got a story. Is even a quarter written? Probably not. Where I look at the fall of Richard II and envisage him having a sort of erotic sort of set up with his closest advisors, which creates scandal. I don't think that happened, but I just think it's a really interesting way to look at favoritism and the damages it could do, but using a modern sensibility to kind of reflect why it might be scandalous, because we don't think of favoritism as being scandalous because it disrupts the feudal network and makes it harder to install regional order. We don't understand that. So we look for an analogy to say, well, this is why it was scandalous, and we make it something that will be scandalous to us because there's a sort of weird kind of Me Too culture going on there, which is pretty horrible. But I don't know if I'd ever publish that because it would upset people so much that they think they're like, but
Yes.
Richard II probably wasn't even gay. No, he probably wasn't. But but it's fiction. Do you know? I don't know. How do you feel about fiction? And I mean, as an Anne Boleyn enthusiast, expert, really, and she's been so diversely treated in fiction, it must
Yes.
be interesting for you.
I think with Anne Boleyn, my preferences are that either they're kind of accurate to her story and are told in a compelling way and bringing
Mm,
her to life as much as we can be accurate because there are obviously questions. Or I like the ones when they're so off the wall that you
mm,
can't believe them, like alternative
yeah.
history. Because with those two, I don't get I don't get cross when I'm
Yeah.
reading
Yeah.
them. It's the ones where it's the ones where there's an author's note at the back telling you
Mm,
that this is an accurate retelling of Anne's story, and then it isn't.
mm,
And
mm,
I just hate ones that cause confusion, that
mm.
people feel is accurate because the author is telling them it's an accurate retelling, but it's not. You know, the other Bling girl is my
I'm
gripe
sure. I'm
because
sure.
the whole incest and Anne being accused of murder in the
Mm,
author's note. So
mm.
I find that one difficult because people believe it because the author's notes tell them to
Yeah.
believe it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't have
And
a problem with it, I think, if it was just
yes.
straight fiction. So
Yes. Did you watch or have you read the Lady Jane Grey? Oh, I can't remember what it's called now, but the one that's very clear that like the not it's sort of like the historically accurate. This is like the not historically accurate story of Jane. And there's
yes,
magic in. I
the
mean,
one
it's
that's been on
yeah,
Netflix with
yeah,
them,
yeah.
yeah, with them changing into animals and that. Yeah,
Yes.
I love it. I thought
I
it was
thought yeah,
fantastic.
me too, me too. But again, no one's pretending it's history.
Yes,
So
but it does handle issues that
mm,
are in Jane's story, and I think it does it really well.
yeah,
But it's so off the wall that you know that it's fiction, and yeah, I love
yes,
it.
yeah.
I loved the series and I loved the book on that. Yeah, Lady
Yeah, I've
Jane,
not
My
read.
Lady Jane, wasn't
That's it.
that?
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
not read the book, but I've got it, so I should read it.
Oh, it's fab. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So what's next in the pipeline for you? Anything Tudor or Wars of the Roses themed?
Yeah, there is stuff in the pipeline. The problem is, I'm halfway through a master's program at the moment in history, and it's reminding me how much I don't know, if that makes sense. So
Yes.
I am halfway through another book which has been commissioned, but I've had to sort of honestly say, like, I really just do think I'm going to need to spend a little bit longer on the academic research to this because unlike Arthur, where there has been some very good scholarship, and anyone interested in Arthur must read um, uh, Sean Cunningham's work on Arthur. But but generally speaking, there's not loads of really hot debates going on around him. That's not true of the next book I'm working on because it's set in sort of 1483 to 1485 and the fall of the House of York and the rise of the House of Tudor, which, as you know as well as I do, there are very strong sensibilities about. So I'm just taking much longer on it than I thought I would in order to make sure that I can still feel that I'm happy to put my name to a year after publication, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's a tough subject to handle
Yeah.
because, as you say, there are so many really strong feelings. I mean, things get nasty, don't they, online when you start looking at that period. So,
Yes, they absolutely do. And I'm looking at it from Margaret Beaufort's perspective in terms of looking at
mm,
her role in it. But actually, there's at least one more Margaret Beaufort book just coming out. So I think I also need to read that and think, well, hang on a minute. Is there anything, have I got anything more that needs to be said? There's so many really good contributions recently. So I am still intending to write, but I don't know exactly when it's going to be what. But I am
mm,
doing a lot more podcasting now, not with the regularity that you're doing it, but I'm working with a chap called James who's much more into sort of 20th century royalty, royal history than me. And we're trying to work on some stuff as well, but it's a time of the day
mm.
thing, isn't it? As you know, of course, as well as
Yes. Yes, you commit yourself to something. I mean, I committed to these on this day, and then life can get in the way
Mm,
sometimes, and you think, oh no, people are waiting for me to
yeah,
post the next one. So it is tricky. Time management is
mm,
really, really tricky with these things. But
yeah,
it makes
yes.
it easier when it's your passion, though.
Absolutely. And the thing that I've always said with Royal History Geeks is the second it feels like school is the second I'll stop doing anything. So
Yes.
I
Yeah.
try not to. And actually, I made it, a lot of people have said to me, why don't you do on this day? Or why don't you do? So it's like, well, because as soon as I start doing that, I know what I'm like. As soon as that starts being on a schedule, I just quite like just waking up one morning and sort of trolling a few Ricardians and seeing how it goes. Always meant in love. Always meant in
Yes.
love.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So, if you could give advice, one piece of
Mm,
advice to new history writers trying to break into publishing,
mm.
what would it be?
Start writing. I think that people forget that it's called writing a book. It's not called thinking about a book. It's not even called researching a book. It's called writing a book. So yes, I did leave some of my writing late because it's sort of my main thing. But as soon as you start researching, just pull together 600 words on it,
Mm,
and don't wait until you've got a 100,000 word book to take to a publisher. Start a little blog, start contributing posts, and then you'll be amazed at how much you find the process of writing helps your research and your reasoning, but also you'll get a sense for whether there's an appetite for it, for whether people are engaging with it, because those are the things that a publisher's going to want to know if you're going to go down a traditional route or if you're going to go down a self-publishing route. You need to know there's an audience for it, so it's the best way of starting.
yeah, and it's good practice. I mean,
Mm.
blogging for me, blogging regularly was good practice. Every day I
Yeah.
would write. I didn't really believe in writer's block because even if I didn't want to write about
Mm.
on the specific project that I was supposed to be focusing on, I
Mm.
would write something that day. And
Yeah.
just, I
Yeah.
think it's so important to keep in practice.
It is, and the thing any budding writer has to realize is no one likes their first draft, and you've never seen your favorite author's first drafts, and I
No,
think
very
that's important
true.
for people to remember.
Yeah. So now getting on to some kind of fun off the cuff kind of
Oh yeah.
questions. Which Tudor, apart from Arthur, would you most like to interview, have a sit down with, and just grill them?
Hmm. Do they have to be a blood Tudor, or can they be of the Tudor era?
No, Tudor era.
Tudor
Tudor
era.
era.
Oh, it would probably would be Margaret Beaufort. I mean, she is a blood Tudor, I suppose. I think it would be because I think what happened between 83 and 85 is quite fascinating, and I'd love. Well, but would she tell me the truth? I guess that's the
Hmm.
thing. I'm not suggesting she was involved in the disappearance of the princess in the tower. I think that's a bizarre theory. Um, of course, I'd love to. Oh, you've asked me one, but of course, I'd love to speak to Anne Boleyn as well. Of the six, she would absolutely be the one I'd want to speak to.
Well, my next question actually was going to be which three historical people would you invite around for a dinner party? So you could have Margaret Beaufort, Anne Boleyn, and
Oh, I
someone
don't think
else.
they'd get on very well. Or maybe they would. I don't know.
Oh, I don't know. Intelligent, strong women.
Intelligent, intelligent and strong and intellectually curious. Yes, true, true.
Perhaps you need who would the third one be to balance them out
Oh,
a bit?
are you gonna need? Um, I mean, I'm quite opinionated too. So, who would be a peacemaker to balance out that group? I wonder, or a true diplomat. Um, ooh, let's bring. Hmm. Do you know what? Actually, I think she wouldn't be the peacemaker. I think it would have to be Elizabeth the First as well. I still think she's much later than I'm normally interested in, but I still think she has to be one of the most fascinating people to ever wear the crown of England, doesn't she?
Definitely. You wouldn't get a word in edgeways with those three
No,
women, though.
no, indeed. My Middle English is all right though, so I think I'd follow much of
Okay.
it.
Favorite place to visit to feel Arthur's world the most vividly?
Well, for Arthur's world.
Hmm.
Well, I think it would be Ludlow because that's the only place with any certainty that we know he spent a great deal of time. And it's
Yeah.
probably the only building. He may have lived more in Bewdley, which is just down the road. Locals would probably not appreciate my description of just down the road. But the actual house he lived in doesn't stand. So for Arthur, I think yeah, it's the only one really.
It's very atmospheric
Yeah.
there as well, isn't it, Ludlow? Yeah.
Yeah, and you get the sense that it was a fortress when
Mm.
what that
Yes.
must have said, which is why possibly Arthur may have spent more of his younger years in Bewdley, but we don't know.
Yeah. And if you could greenlight a TV drama about Arthur,
Hmm.
who would you cast? Who would you want cast in the lead?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think a lot of the people would now be too old to play him, although in Hollywood it seems that they can basically be any age and play any age, doesn't it?
Well, we can
Uh,
go back in time. We
Oh,
can go
okay.
back.
I mean, Tom Holland would have been a
Oh,
brilliant
yeah.
Arthur, I think. Of course, he was first series of Wolf Hall, and now, I mean, I think it's Tom Holland's like 47 or something, isn't he? But he plays Spider-Man at 16. I don't think he's 47, but I think he's 30. So yeah, he'd be a good Arthur. He's probably more handsome than Arthur was, but it's TV, isn't it? So you're allowed to
Mm,
you can up the sex appeal for TV.
yeah. In 3 words, how would you sum up Arthur? Describe the Arthur that you've come to know through your research.
Determined. Uh, I mean, determined is the word that I always use. So let's say determined, earnest, and human. And
Oh, I like that.
the reason I say human is because there is a little bit of evidence that he sort of had mates and they would banter, and which is why I sort of think there's credibility in the whole bring me some ale, Willoughby, because I mean, what people don't realize is, sorry, I won't go off on a tangent. Arthur was the main boys that were put around him were about 5 years older than him. All of them, one or two were closer to his age. And so his main sort of friendship group when he was an adolescent were boys that chunk older. So just think how much he would have idolized them and wanted to impress them at that age. And therefore a comment like, oh, bring me some ale for this night. I have, been in the
Yeah.
midst of Spain. When you look at it in that context, you're a bit like teenagery stuff.
Yes. Yeah. You can imagine it. He wouldn't want to have come out and said that actually
Mm.
he was having trouble in the bedroom.
Yeah, exactly. With those older
Yeah.
boys who would have been so much more
Yeah.
worldly wise and experienced.
Yeah. Typical banter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, last question then. where can people find your work, follow you online, and grab a copy of your book, Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's Lost Brother?
For Royal History Geeks, most active on Facebook and Instagram, but a little bit on Twitter, just Royal History Geeks on all of those platforms. Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's Lost Brother is available Amazon. It's available most online bookstores and marketplaces, and of course the Pen and Sword website.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Gareth, for joining us. That was a really interesting interview. Because yeah, I enjoy talking to someone else that, like me, has come at writing through blogging and through building up a community as well. It's sort of interesting how
Mm,
I kind of accidentally fell into book writing.
mm,
I'd always been a writer since the age of 11,
mm,
but more creative, fiction. So my history work was kind of all accidental, and
mm.
yeah, it's not a traditional way of getting into it, is it? So it's
No,
interesting to talk to
no, not
someone
at
else
all.
similar.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And as I say, I think you paved the way for many of us. So thank you for all your
oh,
work.
thank you. So this has been a pleasure. Thank you, Gareth Streeter, for joining me on the Amberlin Files YouTube channel today. Thank you.
Thank you.